At 4 a.m., the twin cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis were plunged into total darkness. Stealth-capable helicopters maintained a low-altitude sweep as unmarked federal convoys surged into the streets from every possible direction. There were no sirens or verbal warnings, only the silent flicker of encrypted data on command monitors as the clock hit 0. This was far from a standard law enforcement action. It represented the most significant coordinated tactical strike in the history of Minnesota, executed by the FBI and DEA against a shadow organization that had thrived in plain view for a decade. Official reports regarding the operation indicate that 197 high-value targets were apprehended during simultaneous raids on both homes and businesses. Federal agents managed to seize a staggering volume of illicit currency alongside hard evidence of a deeply entrenched logistical network. The factor that truly distinguished this syndicate was not merely its massive footprint, but its highly disciplined operational methodology. This was a paramilitary-grade structure, hidden behind the facade of everyday suburban life, right in the heart of the Midwest. Just moments before the tactical teams breached their targets, late investigators realized the stakes were higher than any previous bust. If this criminal infrastructure had managed to evade capture, the region might have permanently transformed into a primary artery for international crime. This is the definitive account of how that looming threat was finally brought to light. Before we explore the tactical specifics, be sure to subscribe to Military Power to stay updated on these high-stakes operations. The narrative of how federal authorities dismantled this expansive network doesn't start with a high-speed chase, but with the subtle pulse of American commerce. Minnesota serves as a critical junction for the nation's logistics and industrial trade. The state's vast network of interstates, rail systems, and shipping hubs links St. Paul and Minneapolis to the rest of the country's economic engine. In many respects, this heavy reliance on freight and trucking provided the perfect cover for a criminal entity to hide in plain sight. Modest warehouses tucked away in industrial parks and fleets of generic box trucks allowed the group to blend into the daily buzz of local business. Beneath the surface of these routine deliveries, a much more sinister operation was quietly unfolding. Scores of drivers and cargo manifests that appeared legitimate on paper were actually components of a web the feds had been monitoring. This was no disorganized band of street-level offenders, but a sophisticated three-tiered hierarchy characterized by military-style discipline. At the pinnacle were the architects, who managed the group's massive financing and complex logistics. The middle tier consisted of operational managers who supervised the flow of cash and specific transport routes. On the ground, a legion of couriers and operatives moved assets and intelligence across state lines with mechanical precision. Federal agents estimated that approximately 200 individuals were integrated into this machine, each fulfilling a specific role in an unprecedented criminal conspiracy. Beyond the arrests, authorities later disclosed that an incredible $652 million in liquid assets had been funneled through the organization's secret financial channels. Looking at the raw data, it was clear that this was not a case of simple theft or local racketeering. This was a sophisticated financial engine capable of generating and laundering capital on a scale that rivaled mid-level international syndicates. The spectrum of illegal activities linked to this group was truly comprehensive. Federal indictments and subsequent media coverage detailed extensive involvement in large-scale narcotics trafficking and regional money laundering. While most cartel investigations focus solely on the drugs, this network's influence was much wider, merging logistics with high-level financial crimes. The joint operation by the FBI and the DEA was landmark not just for its results, but for the level of secrecy it maintained. For years, the group had managed to avoid the radar of local police by shunning the typical hallmarks of criminal life. They didn't drive flashy cars or engage in public turf wars that would attract unwanted attention. Instead, they navigated the very infrastructure that keeps the American economy moving. To an outside observer, their freight terminals and bank transfers looked like any other part of the Midwestern supply chain. This leads to a critical question of how such a massive enterprise could function for so long without setting off red flags. In communities where heavy transportation and commerce are constant, separating legal activity from illicit flow is a monumental task. The syndicate exploited this inherent ambiguity, embedding their daily operations within the natural rhythm of the Minnesota landscape. They utilized front companies and innocuous office spaces to mask their true intent, effectively camouflaging their movements from conventional police work. By the time the feds were ready to strike, they had spent months constructing a detailed map of the organization's influence. Through the use of advanced surveillance, financial tracking, and confidential informants, investigators gathered the leverage they needed to move in. This meticulous preparation paved the way for the massive takedown that paralyzed the network across the Twin Cities. With nearly 197 individuals in handcuffs, the government effectively dismantled a shadow economy that had been growing beneath Minnesota's surface. The operation itself was executed with a level of mechanical precision that left no room for error. Tactical teams hit their targets at the exact same second, despite being separated by miles of urban sprawl. From private residences to high-rise apartments and industrial zones, the breach was so fast that suspects had no time to react. This wasn't a gradual escalation of force. It was a synchronized hammer blow designed to decapitate the network before a warning could be sent. In quiet neighborhoods, agents moved through doorways with a speed that suggested weeks of intense rehearsal. Meanwhile, armored units in industrial sectors sealed off loading bays that had looked harmless for decades. At many of the target locations, the suspects were caught completely off guard in the early morning hours. However, the initial silence didn't last long, and the situation quickly turned volatile. Federal court records indicate that teams encountered immediate gunfire at several sites as they made their entry. This was the exact scenario for which the agents had prepared, shifting instantly from an arrest posture to a containment strategy. Specialized overwatch units and snipers were already positioned on rooftops to monitor windows and high-ground firing positions. In one documented instance, shooters attempted to engage from an upper floor, but were immediately suppressed by tactical teams before they could escalate. Every movement made by the federal units was calculated, clearing corridors with a discipline typically seen in active combat zones. What struck the agents most was the high level of preparedness shown by some of the suspects. They encountered doors that had been reinforced from within and entry points designed to delay even the most advanced breaching equipment. Federal charging documents noted that many locations featured pre-positioned security measures and dedicated lookout posts. This was clearly not a case of desperate criminals acting on impulse. It followed a very specific tactical pattern. As the raid progressed, it became obvious that the syndicate had developed its own internal contingency plans for a confrontation. At one specific warehouse, agents found evidence that sensitive documents were being shredded just moments before the breach occurred. At other locations, suspects attempted to regroup and hold their ground rather than simply fleeing the scene. These were the hallmarks of a group that had rehearsed their response to a law enforcement raid. By the time the first wave of entries was completed, dozens of high-level suspects were already processed into custody. However, the most chilling realization for the federal commanders was only just starting to surface. The resistance they faced didn't look like the typical panic of a cornered criminal. It looked like the trained reflexes of an organization with significant tactical experience. Their movements were purposeful, and their communication was sparse but extremely effective under high pressure. This specific observation would soon become the focal point of the entire federal investigation. According to the prosecutors, the network functioned with an internal discipline rarely seen outside of paramilitary groups. While no official military ties were formally alleged, the way they fought raised serious questions about their background and training. By sunrise, a significant portion of the organization's regional infrastructure had been successfully neutralized. But the real takeaway of the morning wasn't the arrest count. It was the confirmation of their readiness. The raid hadn't caused a breakdown in their ranks. It had simply triggered a pre-existing defensive playbook. This brings us to the core mystery of the entire case. Who provided them with this level of tactical training? Hours after the initial gunfire had ceased, a discovery in an industrial park on the edge of St. Paul changed everything. Federal teams pushed into a location that had never appeared in any previous intelligence reports or public records. From the street, the building was a completely unremarkable warehouse surrounded by typical loading docks. Once inside, investigators uncovered a facility that completely reframed the scope of the entire operation. Hidden deep beneath the warehouse was a sophisticated, multi-level command center designed to remain invisible to any routine inspection. Federal filings described a space packed with server racks, professional-grade radio gear, and detailed mission boards. This wasn't a temporary hideout. It was a fully functional nerve center for a regional criminal empire. Whiteboards featured complex delivery routes, time-sensitive windows, and coded identifiers for every moving part. The radios were organized by specific operational functions, and redundant power systems ensured the center remained online during outages. It was immediately clear to the agents that this infrastructure had been planned and maintained with long-term goals in mind. This discovery shifted the narrative from a standard criminal sweep to the exposure of a permanent headquarters. As analysts began cross-referencing this new data with existing intelligence, the pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. Regional news outlets confirmed that investigators now believed the group had been embedded in the community for several years. This command center was the missing link that explained how they maintained such tight coordination while staying off the radar. For a moment, the tactical momentum slowed, as specialized teams moved in to document every inch of the facility. This wasn't just about picking up evidence. It was about deciphering the DNA of a new type of criminal organization. At the federal level, groups are now judged by their ability to plan, communicate, and adapt to pressure. What the FE saw in that basement fit the profile of a modern, logistics-driven syndicate. This was a system designed for longevity, not just a collection of individuals taking advantage of illegal opportunities. The seized documents revealed long-term strategic thinking, including plans to expand their influence through legitimate-looking shell companies. Their delivery routes were expertly overlaid with existing commercial traffic to avoid any suspicion. According to summaries from the prosecution, the data pointed toward a slow infiltration of the state's economy rather than a sudden move. As the analysis deepened, the feds reached an even more unsettling conclusion about the group's reach. It appeared that Minnesota was not the heart of the organization, but merely a single strategic node. The recovered schedules referenced routes that extended far beyond state lines into other major hubs. Digital footprints suggested that they had already developed contingency plans for relocating their operations if the feds closed in. This was a level of foresight that investigators hadn't expected to find so early in the process. The command center proved that the network had already accounted for the possibility of arrests and asset seizures. That type of strategic awareness usually reflects a background in high-level operational security or external professional training. By the time the sun was high over St. Paul, the true gravity of the discovery had set in for the Department of Justice. The arrest totals and the seized cash were significant. But the command center was the real prize. It revealed an organization with the ambition to control movement, money, and information on a grand scale. The message to the federal government was clear. They had disrupted much more than a local drug ring. They had exposed a blueprint for a shadow economy that likely extended across the entire country. The question was no longer if the network was dangerous, but how many other nodes were still operational. Following the exposure of the command center, the pace of the investigation shifted from tactical speed to analytical depth. This was no longer a manhunt. It had become a forensic reconstruction of a years-long infiltration. Teams from the DEA and FBI began tracing the group's history to see how they first arrived in the Twin Cities. They found that the organization didn't arrive as a cohesive cartel, but as a series of unrelated individuals. Drivers took regular jobs. Small businesses were established with perfect paperwork, and warehouses were leased alongside legitimate firms. Initially, there was absolutely nothing to suggest that these entities were connected in any way. It was only through the alignment of financial records and communication patterns that the feds saw the true shape of the beast. The organization was built on a three-tier model designed to maximize security and minimize exposure. At the base were the couriers who handled the physical movement of goods and currency under strict operational security. These individuals were kept in the dark about the larger goals of the organization to prevent a single arrest from toppling the house. Above them were the managers who controlled the logistical flow and ensured that everything stayed blended with commercial traffic. These individuals rarely handled any contraband themselves, acting as a buffer between the street and the leadership. At the very top was a 9-member council that operated using rotating aliases and high-level encryption. This compartmentalized structure is exactly why the network was able to survive and thrive for so long. Most police operations focus on visible crimes, but this group was designed to absorb personnel losses without skipping a beat. When one cell was compromised, the routes simply shifted to another legitimate-looking front business. They avoided violence whenever possible, knowing that a low profile was their greatest defense against federal scrutiny. Financial forensics eventually broke the stalemate, as investigators identified banking patterns that didn't match the reported income of the front companies. Media reports later confirmed that authorities tracked hundreds of millions of dollars, eventually reaching the $652 million mark. This financial trail was the first real evidence that the organization was far larger than anyone had initially suspected. Then came the true turning point. The investigation wasn't actually started by a raid, but by a series of anonymous tips. Insider sources provided the feds with specific drop schedules, internal locations, and details about the group's leadership hierarchy. While the authorities were initially skeptical, surveillance quickly proved that the information was incredibly accurate. These tips allowed the government to map out the organization's intent and timing with surgical precision. It became clear that someone with deep access to the syndicate was feeding information directly to the FBI. That insider knowledge changed the entire landscape of the case, allowing warrants to be served with total confidence. Slowly but surely, the internal structure of the organization began to collapse under the weight of the evidence. However, the identity of the person who betrayed the network remains one of the case's most guarded secrets. Federal officials haven't commented on the source, but it's clear that the intel was the deciding factor in the fight. This proves that the battle wasn't won by force alone, but through a decisive breach in the organization's wall of silence. This leaves us with a lingering question. Who decided to burn the system down, and what did they hope to gain? When the first wave of arrests took place, the remaining members of the network didn't just give up. Encrypted traffic surged, as the organization attempted to activate its emergency fallback protocols in real time. Agents watched as locations still under surveillance began reinforcing their defenses and destroying evidence. At several sites, investigators found partially destroyed hard drives and burned documents as the group tried to erase its digital footprint. There were even desperate attempts by logistics crews to extract high-value assets before the perimeter was fully sealed. These efforts were largely unsuccessful because the feds moved much faster than the syndicate had anticipated. The government locked down the surrounding roads and tightened the noose around the Twin Cities within hours. Despite the pressure, the group's behavior remained strangely methodical rather than chaotic. They focused on a controlled withdrawal, prioritizing the destruction of sensitive data over the survival of individual cells. This focus on information security would ultimately become a major part of the subsequent legal proceedings. Even with the attempts to wipe the servers, federal cyber units recovered a massive amount of actionable intelligence. These logs and schedules provided a roadmap of the organization's activities far beyond the borders of Minnesota. This turned the investigation into a high-stakes race between the government's legal process and the group's ability to adapt. Every hour was vital as the feds tried to interpret the data before the remaining cells could vanish. This is where the sheer scale of federal coordination finally overwhelmed the syndicate's defensive planning. Analysts worked around the clock to link the seized data with ongoing financial tracking and satellite surveillance. What they found was a clear picture of a criminal enterprise with potential international reach. Then came the discovery that tempered the celebration of the successful raids. As the arrest count climbed toward 200, it was confirmed that the top-tier leadership council had vanished. The 9 individuals who ran the organization were nowhere to be found in the custody lists. Their residences were cleared out, and their communication devices had gone completely dark hours before the breach. The leadership had recognized the signal and moved decisively to avoid the federal dragnet. This serves as a stark reminder of the reality of modern, high-level organized crime. The bosses don't wait for the doors to be kicked in. They disappear at the first sign of a security breach. By the end of the operation, the FBI and DEA had achieved a historic victory by any metric. They had dismantled a multi-million-dollar logistics empire and put nearly 200 operatives behind bars. Yet, the final takeaway is one of ongoing motion rather than a complete ending. A sophisticated system was cracked, but its architects remain at large, likely planning their next move. This reality sets the stage for the final chapter of this unprecedented federal investigation. As the dust settled over the Twin Cities, the impact of the operation began to be felt across the entire state. This case now stands as a primary example of how federal agencies are evolving to meet modern criminal threats. Success in today's world depends less on brute force and more on the mastery of data, timing, and interagency cooperation. This wasn't just a raid. It was a sophisticated campaign designed to counter an equally sophisticated enemy. The core takeaway is that crime is no longer just about violence. It's about infiltrating the systems we use every day. The fight has moved from the streets into the supply chains and digital networks of the modern economy. This leaves us with one final thought to consider as the investigation continues. Do you believe this operation was the end of the network, or just the beginning of a much larger federal campaign?